All right, so I'm Mark Peake. I am the senior pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Monterey, California. I've been the senior pastor at this congregation for about almost 10 years. I'm in my 10th year at this particular congregation, and I have been a pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA since 2001. And happy to answer your questions.
And one quick addition onto that, where did you go to seminary, Mark?
I went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which is on the North Shore of Boston. Graduated in 1997.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let's start it off with some basic ones, Mark. Could you describe to me what a Christian is?
Yeah, so I guess there's probably two answers. There's an academic answer that the rest of the world would think about, and then there's the answer that folks in the church would probably give. The academic answer would be anyone who goes to or is affiliated with a group that self-identifies as Christian, and there might not be much to be said about an individual's commitment to a Christian ideal there. It's just a matter of I have an affiliation with this group. Inside of the church, when we talk about what is a Christian, we, especially in Presbyterian circles, we think about an individual's commitment to Jesus Christ as well as to the community that represents Jesus Christ. So an individual would make a personal commitment and a personal confession of Jesus Christ as sovereign in one's life, as Lord. I think that's pretty standard theology for most Orthodox churches.
Okay. Well, with that confession, how does one go about becoming a Christian?
Yeah, so I think in the Presbyterian Church we identify a couple different ways. Like for me, there's never been a moment in my life where I didn't identify as a Christian. I mean, just church and faith and Christianity were just something that was always a part of my life. My parents were leaders in the church, elders and deacons, and so it didn't matter if you were in my parents' house on Saturday night, you went to church on Sunday morning. Even if you were just a friend spending the night, you're going to church with us because that's what we do. So I am what folks would call a cradle Christian. But then there was a moment in my life, and I'm just using myself as a personal example because it's
Okay.
easiest, where when I was in college, where my life was just in a weird place and I had to figure out where my life was going. And what I fell back on to was all of the things my parents had taught me, all the things that I had learned at church, and I made a personal commitment to Christ. So I think in Presbyterian and Reformed understanding, there is a community aspect to it, but there's also always this element of personal confession. In Scripture it says, believe in your heart and confess with your tongue, and in standard Presbyterian theology, that is required to join a church and to be considered a part of the community. That's why when new members come forward, they have to come in front of the whole congregation. Well, first they have to be examined by the elders, then they have to come in front of the congregation and confess that Jesus is Lord and that they reject sin and turn from evil in the world. It's not only a heart thing, but a verbal confession of Christ, which says to the world and the community that I am a Christian. This is what I'm going to do, and this is now how I'm going to try to live.
Okay. I think you may have partially answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. What is an individual's role in that process of salvation?
Yeah, I was curious about that question because you said, "What is your role?" And I was wondering if you meant my role
Sorry.
as a pastor, as if you meant an individual. I think the individual's role is in response to God's grace already working. Presbyterian, there's a great resource if you're ever really curious about where it all is for the PCUSA. It's called Theocademy. So theocademy.com, or maybe it's .org. I don't know. But in the first of that video series, when they're talking about Presbyterian theology and history, they say in the Presbyterian alphabet, A is grace. There are a lot of important theological ideas, but we begin with grace, and salvation is by faith through grace alone. So God's grace is already working, and the individual responds to it. It's always, in Reformed understanding, the first move is God's, and then we respond to it.
Right. Okay. Now, speaking of like your specific church and denomination, PCUSA, can you describe kind of the government of your individual congregation and also your denomination as a whole?
Yeah, so it's representational. The word Presbyterian comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which means elders, and it's was deliberately organized that way, beginning with Calvin in Geneva, to be a representational body. Although I wouldn't argue that John Calvin was necessarily the greatest advocate of individual freedoms. He was pretty authoritarian in his personal point of view, but it's representative. So congregation will elect elders, and depending on the size of the congregation and the bylaws of your congregation will determine how many elders serve at any given time on a group that's called the session, which anyone not familiar with could just think of that as like a board of directors. So they're the session, and they are individuals, male and female, who demonstrate in their personal life and in the life of the congregation a commitment to Christ and the things of the church. In my particular congregation, we have 12 elders on our session, each one responsible for a different area of church life, everything from house and grounds to finance to education to evangelism and church growth. There are a ton of different things. And then the 12th elder serves as what we call a clerk of session, which is basically the person who knows all the rules and is a recording secretary. And I think most PCUSA churches, you will find that same structure. There are some legal realities, some secular realities. So some churches you will also find an actual board of directors where there's a president and a secretary, and that usually is because the state requires for incorporation certain titles and certain things to happen. And the technical term for that is bicameral versus unicameral. Do you have one board or do you have two? And usually if there's a literal board of directors, that's pretty much just finances and real property and all that stuff. And then the session handles the church side of it. But for my congregation and every congregation I've ever served, there's only ever been a session. And to satisfy any state requirements, you name someone on the session. Oh, you're going to be the president for this year, and you're going to be the secretary for this year for any time you have to sign something. And from that group of people, we elect.
Hold on one second, Mark. Before we go beyond your church to the next level, and you may have answered this, and I apologize if I missed it. How does your church decide on the session and your elders?
Yeah, so we have a nominating process, and for most churches, that process is laid out in your bylaws. So every individual congregation might be a little bit different, but basically, what a nominating committee is made up out of is usually a current member of the session. If you have a board of deacons, which focuses more on pastoral care than administration, a representative from that, and usually have at-large members from the congregation that are nominated as well. And if you have other larger groups, like we have a Presbyterian women group in our congregation, so we've said that's a pretty important group. We're going to give them representation on the nominating committee as well. Different churches, there's no standing rule, no book of order rule that says you have to do that, but a lot of churches will do that because it just makes sense to have representation. Then the nominating committee will bring a list of names and before the congregation during an annual congregational meeting, and that nominating committee is elected, and then for that year they go about the work of finding and discerning which individuals would fit well on the board of elders or on the session. And what we try to do is not just fill empty seats. Like you don't say, oh, that person's a teacher, they'd make a great children's education elder. What you look for first is people who have demonstrated a deep spirituality and faith to Christ in their own lives, and have demonstrated a commitment to the life of the church overall. And once you've done that, then you try to fit them into the proper place and the proper committee work, knowing that they can then, as leaders in the church, recruit people with specific gifts to help them with their work. So ideally, elders are not merely administrators. They're visionaries. They are trying to discern the spirit and the call of the spirit in the life of the congregation. And those elders then, just like the nominating committee, are elected every year by the congregation at a congregational meeting to serve a 3-year term. And they can serve 3 years, and then they can be reelected for another 3 years, but they can only ever serve 6 years in a row. And that's a book of order requirement, that you can't serve more than 3 years without taking a break.
6 years.
You can't serve more than 6 years without taking a break.
we're working on that becoming a board of directors requirement here at Susquehanna, actually.
Yeah, it makes sense because you can faithfully follow the call of the Spirit at any moment, realizing that any problem you have with an individual will go away every 3 years. So, yeah.
Fair. All right, now you can go ahead and the greater government of your denomination.
Yeah, sure. So it's divided into a couple of different things. So you got the congregational leadership. Then we have a regional group called a presbytery, and that's usually a small geographic region. So for where I am in California, if you pull out a map and show your students, you would show them from Carmel, California, north through San Jose, all the way up to just about the border of San Francisco is the range of the San Jose Presbytery, and it goes inland east for quite a few miles as well, as far out as Gonzales and Soledad inland, and that's I think right now we have roughly 22 congregations in that presbytery gathering. We had about 33 until recently, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the PCUSA church recently. But that is a regional group that has decides vision for the entire area, helps discern what ideas we think should be filtered up higher in the denomination for national consideration. And from the presbytery, folks are elected to serve at the two next largest areas. One is a synod, which is an even larger geographical region, and the largest is the General Assembly, the offices of which are in Louisville, Kentucky. And the General Assembly meets every other year with elected representatives from each of the presbyteries. The synod is kind of a weird thing. It's in between presbytery and General Assembly. And oftentimes I'm not exactly sure what the synods are doing. Our particular synod functions as a financial resource. They have one of the only synods in the country where they have investment tools which congregations and other in the not only in their area but nationwide have access to that for investing, for loans, for things like that. Most synods put out a pretty good newsletter too, and I guess if there is a higher discipline case, like if a presbytery can't resolve a disciplinary issue, it would filter up to the synod as a next possibility. But that doesn't happen very often. Usually any disciplinary issues can be handled at the presbytery level. And it almost never happens that a disciplinary issue makes it to the national stage because there's just too many resources for it to ever get that far. So, so the presbytery, that's the largest, and they meet every other year. The presbytery is the constitutional body. So I'm sorry. The General Assembly is the constitutional. Right. You'll have to excuse me. I was hit by a car not too long ago. The General Assembly is the constitutional body. So if there's an idea at presbytery, presbytery functions like Senate or like the Congress. That's a legislative body. They will come up with a resolution. They will try to find other presbyteries that will concur with them. Once it reaches a certain area, it can be presented to the General Assembly as an idea for the national church. And then the General Assembly would put all that through committee work. And depending on how the committee work at that level goes, it would be presented at the General Assembly for a vote. But then it has to filter back down. It has to be, if the General Assembly, the constitutional body, adopts an idea, it then has to be ratified by a majority of the presbyteries before it becomes part of the Constitution. Okay. So, and this is pretty cool. This model of government was borrowed by the framers of the United States government initially when they were forming their representative form of government. In fact, 2 Presbyterian ministers were signers of the Declaration of Independence, and they were key in developing the idea of the representational nature of government in the United States. So the PCUSA has been here, not the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church had its first General Assembly in Philadelphia, I want to say about 370 years ago. So been here longer than we were a nation and was tied up in that ideal from the beginning.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. That was a...
Sorry, I get geeky about it. I nerd about it.
That was a really good answer. I appreciate that. That was very thorough. Can you describe how and why you became a pastor at your church?
In my current congregation, congregation, or just in general? Okay, so
you can cover both a little bit, but I'm mostly interested in your call to your existing church, like right now.
Yeah, so I've been in pastoral ministry for about 20 years now. And a large part of my initial call had to do with my experience at camp and Camp Susquehanna and everything that went along with that, and conversations with your grandfather. I mean, those were huge conversations for me. Um, as I was leaving college, I realized that my previously decided career track of pursuing law was not where I needed to be. I just had this clear understanding, and Susquehanna was a big part of discerning that I was supposed to be in pastoral ministry. Um, so I finished seminary, served churches in Michigan and New Jersey, kind of learning my chops and getting the experience from an associate pastor in a large congregation to a solo pastor in a smaller congregation in New Jersey. And about the time my wife was pregnant with our second child, um, I began to sense, and it was more of an internal thing, that I wasn't necessarily going to be in New Jersey for the long haul. The fact that my wife was from California and her parents were out there anxious to see her grandchildren, there was this internal sense that maybe that family was important and we needed to reconnect with the family in California. And in the Reformed tradition, that's how calling works. There is an internal understanding of what you're supposed to be doing. There is a preparation of gifts or a recognition of gifts, and then there's the community responds to that, saying, yeah, you do have those gifts, and you are called to there. So it's like a three-pronged thing. It's a stool you can't fall over. As long as those three things are done, you're usually in pretty good. And for me, coming to California, my personal inclination to move to this new church, where they were doing things that I was very interested in doing, and that needed my gifts, plus the confirmation of both communities in my going, and the idea that I was able to do what this church in California needed, all came together to say this was a good move. 240 applicants applied for the job, and they offered it to me. So I figured that's pretty good indication that I was supposed to come here. And yeah, so I'd like to think my coming to this particular congregation wasn't so much leaving where I was as it was coming to this place. Like God was bringing me to this place. The congregation I was serving in New Jersey, we went through some dramatic changes. I took them through a long-range planning strategy for the growth of their congregation. They were in Pleasantville, New Jersey, right outside of Atlantic City, and they were dying. And they weren't doing anything really dynamic in terms of church growth or evangelism. And it required what experts call frame bending planning. Like, we had to completely change where they were and what they were doing. We ended up actually developing a plan that moved the congregation to Egg Harbor Township, about 10 miles down the road, and reforming and doing a completely new ministry in that area. I'm a good vision person. I am not a great detail person. I'm not an administrator. And so when we got to that point, I realized I was either going to have to commit to them for the next 10 years and do work that I wasn't comfortable doing, or I was going to need to get out before they made the move so they could get the right person in there to help them be successful. So I ended up, all the things came together. I mean, there was a church in California that was exactly a match for me, that was close to family, and there was great potential for candidates coming into New Jersey to do the work of basically, it was taking church members who'd been there forever, but planting a new church.
Yeah. I was just going to say, that sounds a lot like church planting.
Yeah. Which is just, that's not where my gifts lay. And so everything came together. They offered me the job out here. After meeting the Presbyterian officials out here, after talking with my family in Pennsylvania, it became clear that this would be a good move. And now I've been here I'm in my 10th year here, and it feels like, for the first time in any ministry that I've been in, it feels like I'm supposed to be here for the long haul. It feels like I could be here for another 20 years, and that would be okay. I mean, I'm always open to God's Spirit directing, but I don't have the feeling that I had in my other callings, where that it was only for a time or a season.
That's great. All right. Back to some theological questions. Could you describe what the PCUSA celebrates as sacraments and like what they're all about?
Yeah, so we have two sacraments, baptism and communion, or the Lord's Supper. In baptism, it is baptism isn't required for salvation. Baptism is a sign and seal of the covenant community, rather. So you're not saved, you're not better with God, or you're not in with God because you got baptized. Simply, baptism is that thing which sets you apart in the same way that circumcision did for Israel. as a member of the covenant community. We affirm both infant and believers baptism, which means members of the community, already confessed and baptized members of the community, can bring forth their children as infants for baptism. And in infant baptism, what we're saying is that before you are even ready to respond, before you even know there is a God, that God has a call on your life. And the community is responding to that call in faith by baptizing you. We affirm that baptism for adults is their affirmation that having been called, you must respond in faith. If God is asking, the only answer is yes. And so you become a member of the community through baptism. As I said, it's an external sign and seal of the covenant community rather than a mark of salvation for us. So grace is not imparted. It's not a Catholic understanding and Catholic understanding of the sacraments. Grace is actually imparted through the sacraments. You are brought into a saving relationship with God by the actual sacrament. That's not how we understand either baptism or communion. For us, communion, the Lord's Supper, is a Eucharistic meal, a meal of thanksgiving, which is a memorial meal, remembering the work of Christ, both in his life, death, and resurrection. So you enter through baptism and you continue through the Lord's table, which is, in poetic language, a foretaste of the feast we will enjoy in the future.
All right. Some other questions about your denomination. One of the things that, in just doing a little bit of research, I noticed that over the last several years, the PCUSA has been shedding about 5% of its membership each year. Can you describe, like, what do you think has led up to this, and whether this is individual churches in decline or congregations as a whole leaving?
Yeah. Yes, both of those things. I mean, there are church realities and there are cultural realities. I think sometimes as pastors, we want to blame the cultural realities instead of saying maybe as a church we're not doing what we're supposed to do. But there is a cultural reality in the United States where overall church membership is just, I mean, if you got rid of all the denominational lines, church membership is down. There are churches like the Greek Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church where their numbers are always up, because if you're born into the church, you're just a part of that, even if you don't go.
Sure.
So to be fair, you'd have to look at their attendance records rather than their membership records. But by and large, there is a decline in the Presbyterian Church USA. We've had a tremendous schism in the PCUSA over the past decade, resulting in many churches leaving for other Reformed denominations. Now, we have a rule that says we will not dismiss a congregation to independent status. So all those churches usually go to other versions of the Presbyterian denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America. Most recently, the Covenant Order of Evangelical Presbyterians, or the ECO Church, is a church that has developed over the last 10 or 20 years. And has received recognition from bodies like the World Council of Churches, so that we're comfortable dismissing them to those places. Most of those questions at each point where congregations have left the PCUSA have been on questions of who can be in leadership. And at first, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church in America, congregations left there, and those congregations were formed because they had a different understanding of where women should be in the church. Can a woman be an elder, a deacon, or a minister of word and sacrament, as I am? That was the first. Most recently, our denomination has said, you know what, every individual congregation needs to discern the Spirit's call. And if there is someone who is gay and feels a call to ministry, then an individual congregation should be able to decide if that calling is legitimate. And so the idea there is that the calling of the Spirit is a higher standard than a man-made rule. So let the congregation discern the Spirit's call. But that is actually, that's a cultural hot button. And a lot of people, it was one of the straws that broke the camel's back. The Presbyterian Church USA also has supported divestment movement in Israel, in what I personally would describe as maybe politically motivated rather than theologically motivated reasons. And there's a lot of more conservative congregations that disappointed them. And they don't want to be told by the larger church how they can invest, or to be told that a deeply seated thing that they hold in regards to Israel is wrong. So all these things came together over the last 10, 20 years to affect many churches leaving. We lost 11 congregations in our presbytery in the last 10 years. But when I'm trying to think who separated from Paul. A bunch of people separated from Paul. But I'm trying to remember what this. There was a pastor preaching a couple Presbyterian meetings ago as we were going through this, and I happened to be the moderator of the Presbytery as these churches were leaving. So it was up to me to like execute the administrative process of all of this stuff. It was pretty hard. But one of the pastors at one of the meetings where we dismissed a congregation said, when Paul, was it Paul and Barnabas? I can't remember. When they left, when they split, the ministry was not halved, it was doubled. So I try to think of it like that. They are earnestly seeking the Spirit and they're trying to be faithful. So I'm praying for their faithfulness and trying to still maintain the relationships with my colleagues who are still in the same area so that we can still do successful things together. We'll see how that plays out.
Well, a lot of denominations like to joke that church splits end up being their most successful church planting techniques.
It can be, yeah. Brennan Manning was a great speaker. I loved all through the 90s. He used to travel with Rich Mullins, and he would give a little talk, and then Rich Mullins would give a concert. And he always told the story about a bunch of pastors who were at a church growth conference. And of course, over the coffee break, everyone starts asking, well, natural question, how large is your congregation? How are things going? And one pastor says, oh man, it's going great. We just had the greatest revival in the history of our church. Really? How many new members? New members? We got rid of half of them. So I don't know. It is certainly true that since we have had the split in our own presbytery, we have been much more unified and focused in the work that we are doing. So like the very first meeting after the final dismissal that I moderated, every single vote was unanimous. And that has never happened to me in any organization for everything that we were doing. So that, I don't know, maybe sometimes you do need, all right, you've got a vision to go this way, and that's a faithful vision. So you go over there, and we have a faithful vision to go and do this thing. We're going to do that, and we'll keep praying for each other as we go. So,
great, thank you. This kind of dovetails nicely into the next question. At least from my perspective, the PCUSA has been rather politically active, and I was just curious, like, how you feel about your denomination taking political positions or being active politically.
Yeah. So I think I'm okay with politics in general, and I'm probably guilty of what I'm going to say I'm not okay with, but partisan sentiment, especially from the pulpit, is not appropriate. Politics, I think, are natural to the gospel. In my opinion, Jesus made political statements all through the Old Testament. There are political realities, including directions for how you treat the foreigner in your midst, including directions for relieving debt and redistributing land. And that's Old Testament Israel stuff. So maybe there's an argument about how that applies to a modern democratic reality, but it's still there. And so clearly throughout Scripture, there is an understanding of political realities. I think that Jesus confronted political realities, not partisan ones, but political realities of empire, and was continually asking the people, who are you going to serve, Caesar, or are you going to serve God? Is it about the kingdom of men or the kingdom of God? And those are naturally going to result in political realities. And the Presbyterian Church has, I mean, from the beginning in the United States of America, before it was the United States of America, has been involved in what can only be defined as political realities. The Presbyterian Church and the Quaker Church were huge in emancipation movements and the end of slavery before the Civil War. Also, Presbyterian clergymen serving in the Continental Congress and signing the Declaration of Independence. They have never been afraid to be a part of those conversations. More recently, we have been, I would say, our most vocal political statements have been along the border in terms of immigration and how that works out. There are many ministries in the Presbyterian Church that are dealing with those issues right now. In my own presbytery, we formed the Emmanuel House, which is a home where people have made it through the applications for asylum can find safety, they come and they stay there. Currently, we have 3 or 4 families staying there and a dozen individual men and women who are staying at this house as all the paperwork is settled. Just gives them a safe place to stay. And some people would say that's a political statement, especially since some of the folks who have come in are of Islamic descent, and that's problematic for some people. So I don't think it's partisan, but I also don't think it would be honest to say it's not entirely political.
Mm.
Places where I feel we've gotten it wrong are maybe with the divestment issue in Israel. Not that I think we should not have divested, but the way in which it was done was clearly and overtly political and not theological.
Mm.
So our denomination has a commitment in its investment policies not to profit off of human suffering. So therefore, we don't invest in tobacco industries, things like that. The argument was made that, well, then we should divest from Israel because there's human suffering going on there. Well, clearly there's suffering going on in that region, but you should have gone through the investment arm of the denomination, not through Israel Palestine study group to make some political point about what's going on in the world. If you want to talk about the investment itself and say that Motorola and Caterpillar are providing missile guidance systems to an army and we don't want to profit off of arms, that's an argument to make. Don't make it about Israel Palestine. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's one way. That's one way I think we've gotten it wrong. It passed because, or I guess in this last General Assembly, it's up, and it has traction because it does fit our definition of not profiting off of human suffering or off of war. But it was just brought forward in a completely and utterly political manner, and that just alienated a lot of people. So politics, I'm okay with. Partisanship, I'm not so good with. I would never endorse a candidate or a specific law from the pulpit, but I would talk about from the pulpit the general characteristics of a faithful community, and would ask people to consider as they vote how a certain policy or voting for. I would never name a candidate, but how their vote would affect their understanding of how a Christian community should exist. Is it consistent with your values? If it is, then do whatever you want. If not, think about it.
Right. Okay. Hopefully this will be your favorite question. Well, I imagine your favorite. Could you describe something that you think the PCUSA is most well known for, especially like things that you're proud of your denomination for?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I am
followed up with misconceptions and stereotypes. So focus on the here.
I do think that the PCUSA, what I always mention, hey, the framers borrowed the Presbyterian form of government when they were forming the nation. So that's not necessarily PCUSA, but they were the first Presbyterians here. And I'm particularly proud of that. And I'm proud of our representational form of government. And I think we're known for that. And I think we're also known for an educated clergy. That's one of our standards for being ordained is that you not only have to go to college, you have to go to seminary, you have to sit for ordination exams, you have to demonstrate proficiency in 5 areas: biblical languages, theology, polity, worship and sacraments, and biblical content. You have to sit for exams on those 5 topics after having received a graduate degree, a Master of Divinity degree, or an equivalent, and then that one of the things we say is we are proud of an educated clergy. That maybe worked to our disadvantage during Western expansion in the United States, because like the Methodists, they didn't require that. You have a Bible and a horse, get out there and get on the circuit. And so the Methodists got everywhere before we did, and so they're all over the place. Presbyterians said, no, you can go to California, but you got to spend 3 years in seminary first. And by that time, it was too late. But
or even maybe a focus on, we got to build a seminary if we're going to build churches out here too.
Right. Yeah. So I am proud of that, and I'm proud of the representational form of government, especially because it means the clergy are held accountable. If I say something that is just completely off the wall, my elders are empowered to say that's completely off the wall. We need to sit down and talk about that. And if it can't be resolved with the elders and the pastor, then there is an apparatus moving up through the presbytery where the presbytery can help unravel those issues. So you don't get issues, cult-like issues. You don't get strongmen leaders who manipulate their community, because it really done properly, it can't happen. And frankly, some of the congregations in my presbytery that I moderated over this latest separation, The primary reason they were leaving is because their pastors resented the oversight of the larger church. They had their own vision that they wanted to move forward with, and that doesn't mean the vision was bad. And it doesn't mean that leadership in that organization is a bad idea. It's just not Presbyterian. And they didn't want that anymore. They didn't want to be told by a committee what they could do. They didn't want to have to go to a presbytery to ask permission to encumber property or to build a new building or anything like that. And they didn't want their property to be held in trust for a larger church either. They wanted to do their own thing. And so they left. And our polity and our policy allows for us to unravel those issues, and it also allows for pastors who are way over the line to be reined in. So those are things I think we do well. That's largely administrative. The Presbyterian Church USA, one thing that I'm really proud for is our Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. It's a part of our mission agency that goes around the world, and it's not only immediate disaster response or mission response, but our commitment in those moments is to be there for the long haul, as long as it takes. So there's the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance still in New Orleans, like however many years later, they're still doing work there, rebuilding houses, helping people get by. And I think that is an essential part of Christian mission, is the long-term commitment to the welfare of the community, and the Presbyterian Disaster Assistance does that very well, and our congregation supports that financially every year. It's one of our biggest gives. So
Sure, that's great. Now, on the flip side, are there any misconceptions or stereotypes that you feel like PCUSA gets and that you'd like to clear up or discuss?
I think I thought about how to answer this question a lot. Of course, I mean, any denomination that's been around as long as we have, whether it's Presbyterians or Lutherans or Episcopalian, whatever it is, you always get that term, the frozen chosen. Like in worship, we're all just sitting there, deadpan staring. No one does anything. I think that's changing a little bit in our congregation. We have two services, one which is pretty spirit-filled and one which is just a bunch of old people listening to the organ. And we just did a major renovation of the organ. It was over $1 million to redo our sanctuary. But as a part of that, we also upgraded everything about the contemporary service so that we have state-of-the-art sound and video equipment for that service as well, which frankly is the growing edge of our congregation. And that's where the majority of younger folks and new believers come into, is that first service. The second service, Monterey happens to be a retirement community as well. It was a former military community. Fort Ord was here, and it was a major staging point in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And so a lot of people have retired back here. And we have one of the few remaining really robust traditional church services with a great pipe organ. So a lot of people still filter here through that. But yeah, Presbyterians get this misconception of, it's just boring worship, and they're all sitting there with frowns on their faces waiting for the plate to pass so they can leave. So that's true. I'm not sure this is an unfair one, but I think people see the PCUSA as the liberal arm of Presbyterianism, and I want to resist that. But if I'm honest about it, it is. We are the liberal side of Presbyterianism. I mean, is there a single other Presbyterian church that affirms anywhere that someone who is gay could be in pastoral leadership? I don't think so. So it would be dishonest to say that that's a misconception. But it's also true that not every individual congregation buys into that. So it's an issue of something being allowable but not necessarily mandated. And I would classify myself over the last 25 years as having moved pretty far left on a lot of issues, because for me the concern is kindness. So I don't know that it's unfair for people to say the Presbyterian Church USA is political or liberal, because you're just honest about it. Yeah, you just need to own that. We are. But I still think we're faithful. I think sometimes people they look at someone else and they say, I think you're wrong. And because you're wrong, therefore you're unfaithful. And I think it's a mistake to say that being wrong is the same as being unfaithful. I mean, if that's true, St. Peter was the most unfaithful person who ever lived. And I don't think anyone would care to make that argument, right? Yeah. So we're growing, right? Just trying to follow the Spirit as best we can.
Yeah. Something we actually discussed in our class, in the first class, was charitable judgment and how important that is, and how to avoid building men and everything. And And R.C. Sproul had a great article about this, and like if he and John MacArthur got into an argument with each other,
Mhm.
they have to, at their core, the argument in their belief system, believe that the other one's earnestly seeking the truth.
Right.
It's a waste of time. But that, at the flip side, then they have to be willing to be convinced by the other one. If they're shown from Scripture that this is wrong, then they're going to adjust their beliefs. And I think that's you have to have that base assumption that everybody is earnestly and truth and faithfully seeking truth, and that
Yeah.
reasonable people earnestly seeking and faithfully seeking truth may disagree.
Yeah. I think that's true. Jay Bartow was my predecessor here. He was the pastor here for 36 years. He's now the pastor emeritus, and basically he's my pastor. He's like my individual pastor. He's one of my great friends. Doesn't often work out that way, where a long-term pastor and the new pastor just end up getting along very well. But we do. And one of the things he said, he did a series of classes at the end of his tenure called Things That I've Learned in 36 Years. And the thing that he ended with is always assume the very best intention on the behalf of the other person.
Yeah.
And if you always assume that, you will much farther.
Yeah.
And it's basically what you're saying. And it's
And
basically
that's
what
an
I was.
outworkings of Jesus's command for us to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we hold our own personal beliefs and biases to the highest degree. If we're truly loving our neighbor as ourselves, that means we're putting their beliefs and biases higher than ours. So we're, yeah. But, well, great. Just a couple more things, Mark. Thank you, by the way, so much for this. This has been really good. I appreciate you sharing all of this. One of the questions that the first several interviews I did with people, I didn't ask this question, but then it all came up in discussion. I think it's because our church is doing a study of Revelation, so everybody's interested in this.
Okay.
But can you describe your personal eschatology, or even like if there's a denominational position on that?
Yeah. Eschatology has not been a huge teaching point in modern Presbyterianism. I would argue maybe not even in the totality of the Reformed tradition. Eschatology wasn't a huge thing, maybe up until the 90s and LaHaye Jenkins and all of that stuff started coming out. Then people started thinking about it again. But what I understand, and the way I most often teach it, is the concept of inaugurated eschatology. And I think the popular term is the already and the not yet. And so the idea is that wherever Christ is reigning in the hearts of a believer or in a community, then the kingdom of God has already, in some sense, begun here on earth. And it's our job is not so much waiting for some other place to get to some other place or to go to some other place. Our job is to, as best we can, transform the here and the now into the image of the kingdom of God. You know, God has given us gifts, resources, community now to try as best we can to do that. I think that is consistent with Hebraic understanding, where they talk about the New Jerusalem and the New Earth. And their understanding, the Hebraic understanding, was never that we were going to leave this place, never to come back. It was always that the whole of creation was going to be transformed into a perfect place, the peaceable kingdom, as Isaiah calls it. So for me, eschatology is less about securing salvation now for a hopeful future or fearfully avoiding punishment. Eschatology is more about realizing that the kingdom of God through Christ and the work of the Spirit is already intruding into the earthly plane. And what are we going to do with that? How are we going to live with that? With Revelation, I've been in ordained ministry. I've been through seminary. I could not make head nor tails consistently of Revelation. I mean, I think there are many faithful ways of looking at it. The way that I have looked at Revelation most often is that it was a somewhat coded understanding of a group of believers in the midst of the Roman Empire, using coded language that we still don't even really understand anymore because we just don't have the historical context for. So out of Revelation, I draw principles of how we as co-heirs to the kingdom of Christ, kingdom of God with Christ, as advocates for God's kingdom now, how do we respond to empire today and in this moment? Where is our faith ultimately going to be held? Because I think there's some of the same questions now as there were then, as governments try to increase their power for the better or for the worse, whatever that might be. How does a faithful person respond to empire, with empire meaning secular authority, the world, competing ideals of how humanity should exist. How do we respond to that?
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you, along with that though, do you think there's a generally accepted belief system regarding eschatology within your denomination? Are there like denominational statements on this at all?
If there is an official denominational statement about the end of time, I'm not aware of it, and that might just be bad. I mean, there is the PCUSA website
Mhm.
does have statements on a lot of different theological issues, so that might be a resource for you to check out before you teach the class. But in general, our focus has not been on what's happening next, but what is God calling us to now?
Mhm.
And the statement I hear over and over again from my colleagues is, if you're doing what you're supposed to do now, then if the end is tomorrow, it won't matter.
Yeah.
You know,
Great.
or as your grandfather used to say, I'm a pan millennialist, and that it will all pan out in the end. So
Yeah. I prefer being a pro-millennialist.
yeah,
In favor of it. I don't know what it is, but I'm in.
yeah, I'm in favor of it.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to add or say about yourself, your church, or your denomination for the benefit of my class that you can think of?
Um, just we are a Christian church trying as best as we can to live into the Spirit's call. My congregation is a very diverse congregation, theologically and politically, and I think how they have described that best describes Presbyterianism in general, in that we disagree in a lot, but we all feel by God to do something together. We feel called by God to do something together, and we can do that thing regardless of whether we all agree on eschatology or women in ministry or whatever that is. We all feel called to do this specific thing in this specific place now together. And so we're going to do that. And I have found that to be pretty much true of most Presbyterian USA churches that I've been to. And it usually involves just caring for the community. For here in Monterey, our primary calling is one of our primary callings is ministry to the homeless. And in particular right now, homeless women. That
Mhm.
is a resource that is just not much of anywhere. There's these women living in their cars with kids. They're single. They have nowhere to go. There's all this housing for men everywhere, but it seems like they've forgotten the women. So that's a
Mhm.
particular thing our community realizes, that even though I don't agree with you on everything and I wouldn't vote the way you do, we all believe that this woman should be taken care of and that God is
Yeah.
calling us to take care of this woman. So we're going to do that. So that's, um, I think that's the best of Christianity, wherever it happens. So,
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mark. I'm going to pause the recording, but I don't want you to leave just yet.
okay.